If we lose the Pirahã language, we lose an entire way of thinking about the world. We lose tremendous amounts of knowledge of the jungle and about every species of flora and fauna that nobody but the Pirahã have. I have seen many animals that, according to the book Mammals of the Neotropics, have been extinct for decades, and yet I've seen them alive running around the Pirahã villages. There are many people who have a career commitment to the idea that I can't be right, because if I'm right, Chomsky's wrong. And if Chomsky's wrong, a lot of careers are based on him. For many, many people, it's his status in linguistics that makes his politics so believable. He needs that credibility to be able to have the voice he has talking against U.S. foreign policy. Linguistic theories are more philosophy than they are science. The linguists tend to get worked up and think they're doing science, but a lot of it is just philosophy.
Today's episode is a conversation with Daniel Everett, a linguist and anthropologist whose work has challenged long-standing beliefs about human language and cognition. In 1977, Dan journeyed deep into the Amazon rainforest as a Christian missionary to live among an indigenous tribe of hunter-gatherers known as the Pirahã. What began as a mission to convert them became a decades-long odyssey that would ultimately transform his own beliefs and worldview. Over the course of 3 decades, Dan spent over 8 years living with the Pirahã. He and his family became the first and only outsiders to have ever mastered their unique language. His theories on the evolution of language propose that human speech emerged far earlier than previously believed. He has shared these thought-provoking ideas in several acclaimed books, including Don't Sleep, There Are Snakes, and How Language Began. So Dan, you first arrived in the Amazon in 1977. A very long time ago. Take me back to that first day that you stepped off the plane. What were your expectations? What were your first impressions of the people there?
Well, I was 26 years old, and as a missionary, I expected that I would probably spend the rest of my life there in the jungle and translate the Bible for them. But I had to learn the language first. So when I first stepped off the plane, I had been thinking about the Pirahãs for so long and preparing myself for over a year for this visit, so that I felt like I was meeting celebrities. In fact, they were famous to me in the sense that they had consumed so much of my time and thought since at least 1976, when I first joined the mission and was asked to work with the Pirahã. And when I stepped off the plane, I had had about a year and a half of linguistics training and very good field methods classes on how to learn a language with no language in common. So even though I was airsick and it was very hot and humid and all the people were talking at once, I just got out my notebook and pen. Didn't have an iPhone back then to record anything. It was just the ear and a piece of paper. And I started asking them questions, how to say things, starting with nouns, building up to phrases. It went pretty much as I had expected and as I had hoped. I knew it was not going to be something that could be done from one day to the next. I thought I had unlimited time there. When you're 26, you sort of think of your life that way, as unlimited in front of you. And so I was making progress. I was repeating back to them very well. I mean, I was good at that kind of linguistics, and they thought I already spoke the language. So they would just start taking off in these long sentences that I had no idea what they were talking about. But I forced myself to write down as much as I could, and they were very friendly and extremely patient and really wanted to teach me, and their enthusiasm and goodwill is what made everything that came possible. My mistakes, I take the blame for, but my successes, I have to give them most of the credit for.
So you make it sound really easy, but in fact, I think their language is quite hard for an average outsider to decipher, right? Because it relies a lot on tonal differentiations that are hard to make for someone who comes from an English-speaking background, for instance.
Yes, it's tone, but also last year in June of 2023, MIT's Brain and Cognitive Sciences Department held a one-day conference in my honor, and people came from all over to speak. And my favorite speaker, of course, was my son, who did a very quantitative study of the Pirahã reliance on vowels. Cross-linguistically showed that there's no language in the world that relies on vowels as much as Pirahã does, which means you get weak sequences of vowels with tones. Every vowel has a tone. So the tones and the vowels make it very difficult to learn because most words in the language to the untrained ear sound very similar. So Magiai is friend and Magiai is enemy. And Che is excrement, and che is me, first person. And then if you get something like ohuachi, look for something. Ohuachi is to cause to look for something. With the extra vowels. And hearing those vowels is very hard for some people. And in fact, it's hard for just about everybody. The only two other people, well, my children learned it fairly well, and they still remember quite a bit of it. My ex-wife learned it very well. And the missionary previous to us, Steve Sheldon, speaks it okay, reasonably well. So it's not impossible. It just takes a lot of work. And one reason that missionaries are the ones that do this is because they have more time than the average scientist. I could spend 6 months at first doing nothing but trying to repeat words and things. By the end of the first year, I was speaking the language relatively well. Somebody going in to do their PhD probably needs to make faster progress. Anytime I've given a talk on this type of methodology to linguists, I get objections that we don't have the time or the money. No funding agency is going to give us that much time in the jungle. And I said, well, I know that. But at the same time, you have to ask yourself, of all the things there are for me to do in the world, do I want to do something that I can't possibly do the best job on? Or do I want to do something else? So maybe field work is not what you should be doing. But then the reaction to that is, well, something's better than nothing. And I can't really argue with that. But it was, even though I totally reject missionary activity and I'm an atheist now, and the fact that I was able to be supported to just live in the village gave me the luxury of time when I was a missionary that most scientists don't have.
Yeah, you've spoken before about how, nowadays when somebody gets a PhD in linguistics, there's not necessarily any fieldwork component to their PhD, right? I guess, how did that change happen and how do you feel about that?
Well, in the 1940s and early 1950s, and any time up till then, if you were going to be a linguist, if you're going to do a PhD in linguistics, you pretty much were expected to do field research and bring to light facts that we did not otherwise know from a new language that had been very little studied or never studied at all. Noam Chomsky's rise to prominence in the late 50s brought about a huge change. Chomsky made statements along the lines that you can learn everything that there is to know about universal grammar, which was his objective, the supposed grammar that underlies all others, by studying one language, English, for example. So many people just focused on their native language. There's nothing wrong with that, but it leaves out all these other more exotic languages. And it's not necessary that if you're a Chomskyan, you don't do field work, but I believe that Chomsky had a very detrimental effect on field.
What is the Chomskyan worldview in general, right? Like when you describe somebody as a Chomskyan, what does that entail?
Well, it basically entails the idea that it's instinctual, like Steven Pinker's book, The Language Instinct, which it's an exposition of Chomsky's view, pretty much. Steve might think that he's got a lot of original ideas in there, and he probably does, but it's basically an exposition of Chomsky's ideas, that we have a grammar hardwired in our in our genotype, and all the different languages that we observe are simply phenotypical distinctions that the environment has created out of that single genotype for all humans. In my work, however, I have seen no evidence, in fact, have argued strongly against that view, that grammar is innate, and have argued that the similarities among the world's languages are due to basic logical principles of how signs can be combined. And therefore, I've gotten much more into the work of Charles Peirce, who is the one who originated the modern theory of signs, semiotics.
Yeah, I remember reading The Language Instinct a long time ago, and I guess at that time it was kind of so convincing that it almost felt like the conventional wisdom, right? So I guess what do you make of all the different lines of reasoning or evidence for the idea that language is innate? So, for example, it's pretty well known that children, as you described, acquire language much more easily than adults do, right? So there's this idea of there's a critical period during childhood development that suggests that language acquisition is genetically hard-coded. So what do you make of that? What's your
Well,
response
I
to
have a
that?
whole book about that called Language, the Cultural Tool. And in that book, I argue against a critical period for language. My argument is that children learn everything faster than adults. And there are a number of reasons for that, including synaptic pruning and the fact that they have a lot more connections when they're born than we do. So it's not just language. They're like little Google search engines. They're statistical generalizers that learn a lot of stuff very quickly. So we can't just limit it to language. And I don't think that their speed. The other thing about the speed of acquisition argument is what counts as fast. I mean, it takes a child many years to learn their language well. And I'm still learning English. I mean, I simply don't find convincing the arguments from universals and that sort of thing. And I would say that's the majority view these days. It's not the minority view anymore. I would say most linguists today, if we survey people from around the world, reject the idea of universal grammar. I'm finishing up one book, and we'll hopefully by June finish up another book, two books on Peirce, one a biography that is an intellectual biography, and the other one is just Peircean linguistics, in which I argue that really that it's not necessary to accept any of the assumptions of the language instinct or Chomsky's work to account for the same facts and more. So I don't find any of the work on universal grammar from a biological perspective to be remotely convincing. Ironically, at MIT, in the linguistics department, you have the #1 center for Chomskyan linguistics anywhere. Whereas in the brain and cognitive sciences department in the same university, you have a fairly anti-Chomskyan environment. So the brain scientists don't really see any evidence for this innate universal grammar. And it's not surprising that it was they who had a conference in honor of my work and not the linguistics department, which would never have a conference in honor of.
Right. You're not really welcome there, right? You joked.
Not too much, no. I wouldn't be the go-to person for them if they wanted to hear the latest research online.
Right. You raised 3 kids in the Amazon. They were ages 7, 4, and 1 when they came to the Pirahã villages for the first time. And they quickly became fluent in the Pirahã language. So what I'm wondering is, what was it like raising kids in that environment? I mean, I know nowadays parents, they can get in trouble for just letting their kids walk home from school by themselves. And this was like a very, very, extreme place to raise kids by kind of Western industrialized standards. Like, what did you do for diapers, for example, right?
Well, we just used cloth diapers for Caleb. He was the only one still using diapers. So wash those down in the river and hang them up to dry. Not a big deal. There are snakes or scorpions and stuff, but the Pirahã live among that. And, we were missionaries. We had faith that our children would be protected. My daughter tells me, well, actually, all 3 of my children tell me they would never take their children there. But they had a great time growing up there. So they said, we lucked out. We didn't die, but we wouldn't take our kids there. And when I was 4 years old and started kindergarten, my mother, it was about 8 blocks from our house and across several busy streets. And my mother walked me there the first day and said, "You know how to get home?" Yep. So from then on, I walked myself across all the busy streets and everything. I was 4 years old.
Wow.
We just didn't think about it back then. And my daughters would leave first thing in the morning, like 5:30, 6 a.m. with a bunch of Pirahã girls in a canoe and take off, and I wouldn't see them again until about 5:30 in the afternoon.
You weren't worried that whole time, ever?
No, I wasn't worried, because the Pirahã girls do that every day, and they know what they're doing. And maybe I should have been worried, probably today I would be, but I wasn't then. I wasn't worried about anything. I wasn't worried about myself. We all got sick. We almost died a couple of times of different things. And, missionaries are tough people, and they're ready to face whatever comes their way for God. Without that basis of faith, I probably wouldn't have the same confidence taking my children today. So it was a wonderful experience, and I believe that all of my children are richer for it. They're almost trilingual. My son is an anthropological linguist and dean at the University of Miami, and he's an extremely successful researcher. And I think his background has a lot to do with that. And his 2 sisters are both into education and healthcare, and they all 3 have a tremendous amount of grit and are able to handle new situations very well. And I think they're much richer people because they had crazy parents.
Yeah, it's really interesting that they got so much value out of it, but yet they still wouldn't do it for their own children. That's really interesting. Um, yeah, so I guess I'd like to ask more about kind of the Pirahã way of raising children. So you kind of point out in your book, I don't know if it's you who pointed it out or Jared Diamond who has drawn upon your work, that basically Pirahã teenagers, they don't go through these like adolescent identity crises, and kind of their relationship with their parents is much healthier. Are there any lessons to be drawn from that in terms of how to raise kids in a Western industrialized society?
I think so. I think there's a lot of good material there. One general rule of the Pirahã, two general rules of the Pirahã are don't show anger, which includes raising your voice. It certainly includes hitting someone, and don't tell other people what to do. And this applies between parents and children as well. A parent would never hit their child. They would almost never yell at them, and they rarely tell them what to do. For example, if a toddler is walking too close to the fire, the parent is not going to run over there and grab them and say, don't you ever do that again. The parent is going to say, that'll burn you, that'll hurt you, but you got to find that out on your own. So if you step in, burn your foot, I'll take care of you. But, I told you. I was raised in my generation, I'm 73, and I was raised when I was a child, I was treated like I was mentally deficient. And when I was a teenager, I was also treated like I was mentally deficient. I didn't have the capability of making adult choices and reasoning like an adult. More importantly, I wasn't trusted to make my own decisions and live by the consequences myself. The Pirahã are raised that you can do pretty much what you want, but don't come running to me that's stating it a little too strong. All Pirahã help all other Pirahã. If somebody severely injured themselves or hurt themselves, no matter what their age, from some stupid action they committed, the whole community would jump in to help them. But basically, you take your chances and pay the consequences. So there's nothing to rebel against. There's no
Mm.
parent that's been telling you you're an idiot or telling you you can't do this and you can't do that. Do it. If you think it works, do it. And if probably it's not going to work, but the parent wouldn't even say that. They won't even say, if a child decides they're going to leave the family and go off and live on their own, well, go ahead. I'm not stopping you.
I mean, that sounds very good in theory, but in practice, does it take a lot of kind of like emotional control for the parents to, you were talking about if the toddler walks toward like a fire, right? Like, what if the toddler is walking toward a cliff? Like, obviously, you can't let the toddler
Well,
find
they do
out.
this. There are river banks that are very high and very steep, and a child could fall 50 feet down into the water. If they're really, really small and barely walking, the mother's going to walk over and grab them by the hand. She's not going to scold them or jerk them. If they're a little bit older, they better not get too close. The parents will tell them you can fall in. And they know that their parents aren't just making that up to get them to obey. The most dangerous animal in the jungle or anywhere else is not the jaguar or the poisonous snake, but it's human beings. And when you live in an environment where you know everybody and everybody can be trusted, it's a much more comforting environment. I would be terrified to let my two daughters at their age, 7 and 4, go off all day and I didn't know where they were with a couple of friends in the city. But in the jungle, I'm much less worried about them because the Pirahã girls that they're with know all about animals and things and can warn my daughters, and my daughters are learning that stuff too. I wanted them to learn that. And I'm not worried about somebody kidnapping them or anything like that because you can trust everybody there. Nobody's going to do that. Foreigners, now if I saw a Brazilian riverboat come up and pass my village situation and go upriver where I knew my daughters were, I would hop in the motorboat and go right up there. I had a motorboat. I mean, I could go up there and check on them, but I never did. But if I saw people who weren't Pirahã go up there, I don't trust them. No
Mm.
matter how well I know them, I just don't trust them like I trust the Pirahã. The Pirahã are not going to harm your children, and they're not going to do anything. They're not going to molest them. That just isn't Pirahã. They won't do that. And so it's much less fearful than just being in a regular town.
Yeah, I mean, the experience of living in a city, it's very alienating just living among strangers all day long.
This is a distinction that's been recognized by anthropologists and linguists for a few decades, distinctions between societies of intimates and societies of strangers. And we live in a society of strangers. When I walk into a town, if I go to Boston, I probably won't see anybody that I know. In our larger U.S. society, the only society of intimates we have are our family, first and foremost, where we know everybody, and we may not trust them all, but we know them all. And our larger community, perhaps, the people who live in our particular small neighborhood. But we really, most of the time, we're in a society of strangers, where the Pirahã are always in a society of intimates.
Right. And so you were part of that society. How accepting were they of your children, right? Like to what extent were they treated like just another couple of Pirahã children?
Yeah, so they accepted them very well. They're very loving people, and they love kids. And so they loved my kids. My kids are all blonde, and so they thought that was really cute, these little blonde kids running around. But, kids are kids, and so a man might make Caleb a bow and arrow that's his size, really, and he loves it, and he goes hunting, and then some bigger kid steals it from him. So these things happen, right? I mean, the bigger kid's not going to hit him. It's not going to beat him up, but he will take the bow and arrow. So I'll just go talk to the guy's father, and the father will say, well, he really likes that bow and arrow. I'll make your son another one, or something like that. So it's not considered theft by them. It's perceived differently. It's who needs what and who's using what. So if, like, my son leaves his bow and arrow sitting a lot, they figure he doesn't need it, and so they'll take it. But nobody ever hurt my children or threatened them or anything. They were always incredibly nice to them, children and adults. So you would expect that some children would be mean, to these little foreign kids, but they weren't. They were all really sweet to them. And so my children learned to love their peers among the Pirahã. They were all very, very close. And that was one of the things I most wanted. And I was delighted when I saw that. And so I wasn't going to put rules segregating my children from the Pirahã children. So whatever the Pirahã children were allowed to do, my children were allowed to do, except that I was homeschooling them. And so several days a week, they had to be, my wife and I were homeschooling them. It didn't take as long as going to regular classes. We could get through the content fairly quickly, and they always did really well when they got outside back to the city and took their standardized exams. They always were fine. So, yeah, they had a wonderful time, I think, aside from the sicknesses. There were 2 times that our lives were threatened by the Pirahãs. I talk about those in Don't Sleep, There Are Snakes. And then my children, because of malaria and because of those threats, started getting a little bit nervous, I could tell. And so we started leaving them when we would go in with friends, and they would live with friends out on the Missionary compound. But I hated that. My wife was raised in the same missionary organization, my first wife. And so to her, that was no big deal. But to me, sort of the whole point of having kids is to be with them all the time. And I didn't like leaving my kids.
Your kids were in genuine danger in those 2 instances, right? What happened?
Well, the Pirahã got drunk and were talking about killing us. I woke up and heard them at midnight. A Brazilian his boat was docked at in front of our house and on the river, and he had told the Pirahã to kill us and given him a new shotgun and gotten him drunk. And so I woke up. This is another reason to speak the language well. I woke up and heard them talking about that. And so I just walked through the jungle. I had flip-flops and a pair of gym shorts on and walked in and got all their weapons before they knew what was going on, and told them hi and smiled and everything, and then walked back to my house with all the weapons, and their reactions were too slow. But they fought among themselves, and they started screaming and yelling, and my kids were really afraid. The next day, they all apologized, but they did it again a few months later. But then they never did it after that. It never started among them. It was all alcohol based both times. But then I made it clear that after the second time, we were going to leave. There would be no third time, and they didn't want us to leave. The women in particular, because of all the medical work we did. And so we never had that problem again. And the Pirahã themselves never had a problem. There were some Pirahã who didn't like missionaries telling them about Jesus, but they still were tolerant. They were very tolerant, probably more tolerant than I would have been if some weird foreigner had come to live next door to me and was telling me I was going to hell or whatever. So they're examples to me of patience and tolerance and acceptance.
So you've talked about how the Pirahã have different cultural values from us. So what kind of reaction did you get when you tried to talk to them about Jesus and God?
Well, they just want to know what evidence you have for these things. And so for them, there are only a couple of kinds of evidence. So you either saw it yourself, or a direct witness told you about it, or maybe a direct witness told them and they told you about it. But there's a direct witness that that's involved. It's not distant. It's not somebody you never heard of. It's a direct witness that you know who it is. You could actually go over and ask them about it. Or it's deduction, such as it's going to be sunny tomorrow because it's been sunny. Or it's induction. I see that John's canoe is missing, therefore John must be out fishing. But they're very empirical, and they want to know what the evidence is that you have for Jesus. And none of my evidence is direct. No Christian missionary has ever met Jesus. Now, they may say they have, but they're only talking in metaphorical, spiritual terms. It's not really physically in meeting Jesus. And so I just didn't have enough evidence to convince the Pirahã. They just found it they're not superstitious. They don't believe in God. God's not a concept that's ever occurred to them. So it's not a necessary thing. And they just found it quaint that these Americans believed in this stuff. But also the Brazilians that they met were all Catholics, and we were Protestants, and Catholics didn't have any kind of prohibitions against drinking like Protestants do. So they said if we were going to become follow any of these religions, that we wouldn't follow yours. But we don't want to follow any of them, because who is Jesus to tell us what to do? Why should somebody else be able to tell us what to do? We don't know who he is. We're not going to do what you tell us he says we should do. So that all makes perfect sense to me now. I think they were the ones who were rational. They were the best anthropologists. They were the ones who were able to look past our differences and not overreact. And they had no expectations for me. I'm different. So people are different. Whereas as a missionary, I saw them as wrong different. They were different in a bad way because they needed to get corrected. They needed Christianity, that kind of, silliness that leads to such conflict in the world.
So in all that time, you and your ex-wife were never able to convert a single Pirahã, and neither could the two previous missionaries before you. And in fact, throughout, I think it was 300 years of contact with missionaries starting from the Portuguese who first went there, not a single Pirahã was converted. Is that correct?
That's correct. They're a very strong culture. They don't feel needy. They don't feel like there's anything somebody else has to offer them. They have the world figured out as they need to have it figured out. So no, there are no conversions, and there are never going to be any conversions unless the culture undergoes a major shift because of some sort of outside pressure that's going to be far greater than a missionary put on them. So, for example, if gold were discovered in their land, they would be flooded with prospectors, which would probably wipe them out. That's the kind of traumatic experience that could lead to major culture shifts. But as long as their culture is left to itself, they feel self-sufficient. They don't feel the need for anybody else's truth about things that they have no good evidence for. It would be like me trying to convert somebody else to Zoroastrianism. It just doesn't make any sense to do.
So I'm wondering, you've done work with about 24 other indigenous tribes in the Amazon, as well as a bunch of groups in North America and Mesoamerica. So I'm wondering, do you feel like the Pirahã are exceptional in this regard in terms of their resilience and inability to be converted? Is there something? Are they uniquely robust to this because of their culture, or is it just because of the specific environmental circumstances that they're in that make them like this?
No, I think they're unique in respect to religion. I mean, every culture that I've worked with is exceptional in some way. They're all full of lessons for us to learn about. But the Pirahã, to give one example, missionaries ever since David Livingstone, the famous missionary to Africa, have used material goods to develop dependencies of the indigenous peoples on the missionary. So you bring out these material things, pots and pans and machetes and all these things that they can't otherwise get. And you give it to them, that gives you a certain amount of power, and they want to please you, so it leads to so-called conversions, which, there's an old expression, if you give the people rice to come to church, they will, and if you give them rice to say they're Christians, they will, but they're just rice Christians. Take away the rice, and there's no more belief. So the Pirahã are not interested in material things like that. I might give them a machete today, and tomorrow it's lost. I don't know where it is. They just don't value material things other than the bow and arrow and the things they make themselves. So they're not after the things we have. They're curious about them because, they're sort of anthropological. They want to know how they work. But I don't need a bow and arrow. I've brought back lots of bows and arrows as gifts for people, but I don't use a bow and arrow. And if the Pirahã gave me one, I wouldn't use it. It would go on the wall somewhere just to show people what a bow and arrow from the Pirahã looks like. So that's their attitude towards the goods that I bring in. And so there's no hook. There's nothing that I have that they want. And that includes Jesus. And there's nothing else I can use, no material good, to get them more interested in the source of those material goods, which I could tell them if I were unethical, was Jesus. And that's what missionaries have done for centuries. They have worked in that way, sometimes not intending to, not realizing what they're doing, but that doesn't work with the Pirahã.
This specific trait, this indifference to material goods, is it actually quite special or unusual or unique, just, on the basis of these other tribes that you've worked with?
Yeah, all the other groups I've worked with in the Western Hemisphere are very, very different in that respect, especially in the Amazon. Most of the Amazonian groups that I work with, the first thing you have to do is deal with the problem that they want everything you have, and you can't give them everything you have. So you have to say that I'll pay you for helping me. So what do you want? And you can work towards me getting you that thing, Whereas the Pirahã, if they want to work with me, they don't want anything, but I give them cloth, and I give them hooks and line, and I give them manioc meal. They love manioc meal because that they don't have to, they just eat that. So I'm hoping to go back, if everything works out, next year. And if I do that, I'll take them a ton of manioc meal and stuff like that. I have no research purpose. I just want to go to say hi, basically.
They seem so unique in this regard, and they were actually the first indigenous people that you worked with. Was it just a big coincidence that they were the ones that you first decided to work with? How do you think about that?
There were two missionary teams in our same mission before us, and neither one of them had been able to really figure out how the language worked. They wrote about it, they thought about it. They didn't get really fluent in the language, and they just felt like they were at the end of their rope. They didn't know what to do. And I had done really well in linguistics classes with the mission, which were quite good linguistics classes at the University of Oklahoma. And so they thought, well, maybe this guy, because I told them we were interested in going to Brazil because my wife was raised in Brazil. And they said, well, maybe this guy will want to work with a Pirahã. So they wrote and they said, there's this group that is not related to any other known group, and it's very strange. In some respects, it's a very hard living situation. Nobody else wants to work there, and the two people that did try to work there didn't make any success. Would you be willing to do that? And of course, I said, yeah, sure, that'll be great, and I was very happy to take on that challenge. I felt like I was, you're pretty confident in yourself when you're really young. When you get older, you realize how full of shit you were so much of your life. But I'm very glad that I did that. And if they hadn't asked me we were just trying to decide whether to go to the Amazon, to New Guinea, or to southern Mexico. And Mexico had a lot of appeal to me because I grew up in Southern California, right on the Mexican border, and we could drive down there, and it was just seemed like and they really wanted us to come. And I love Mexico. But then when they offered us the Amazon, offered us this group that nobody else could work, I just felt like, gee, this is a wonderful opportunity. And I am glad I did it.
You talked about kind of the preparation that you did for this mission, and you were selected in some way because of linguistic aptitude. I'm curious to hear more about what did you come in with in terms of preparation, and what were you tested in that revealed that you had some sort of special aptitude for doing this kind of work?
Well, SIL, the Summer Institute of Linguistics, as it was known in my day, and Wycliffe Bible Translators, they're separate legal organizations, but you have to be a member of both to be a member of one. So you have to be a committed Christian. The training was accredited through major universities, University of North Dakota, University of Texas, University of Oklahoma. So my first SIL training was in 1976 at the University of Oklahoma, and I took classes from Kenneth Pike, who was an SIL member, but also one of the greatest linguists of the 20th century. I think he's a greater linguist than Chomsky, although not as influential. And I learned phonetics, how to recognize speech sounds from any language and how to produce them and how to write them down. And I took phonology, which is how people interpret the sounds of their own language, how they group them and how they think of them. And I took morphology, how words are put together. And I took syntax and grammar, how sentences are put together. And I had classes in semantics and I had classes in translation. So I was pretty well trained. One more semester and I would have had a master's degree in linguistics. And on that basis, actually, all those courses were accepted into the University of Campinas in southern Brazil, where I eventually did.
So you did all of that in just 1 year?
I did it in a year and a half. I just was one course after another for a year and a half. And when I finished, I was probably I was the top student that they had in all those classes. And they told me that many times. And so I knew I was really good at this stuff.
So basically they were sending in the A-team to figure out this really, really difficult language.
Well, that was their perception, and I was arrogant enough to share their perception. And I was humbled many, many times in the meantime. Well, academics is an interesting area because when you first start out, you can stand out. But the farther you go in the field, the more winnowing takes place and the smarter the remainder is. So you're surrounded by really, really smart people all the time. And you sort of get used to it, but you don't stand out, they don't stand out. And I only say that because along the way of publishing, doing a PhD and competing and getting in debates with people all over the world about these ideas, it toughens you intellectually. So I would say that one of the greatest contributions that Pirahã have made to my life is to toughen me intellectually and also physically and also constitutionally.
So speaking of academia, you had a paper in the journal Current Anthropology in 2005, and it turned out to be one of the most controversial papers that they've ever published. The paper claimed, among many other things, that the Pirahã language lacks words for numbers, that Pirahã syntax lacks a very fundamental property in linguistics called recursion, and that the Pirahã culture doesn't have any drawing or other forms of art. What did you expect when you first submitted that paper? Did you have any idea that this was, I'm sure you were very excited, right? This was a pretty big paper and you thought it would make a splash, but what were your expectations when you submitted the paper initially?
Well, that year I was at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology in Leipzig, Germany. Max Planck gives you all these resources to do whatever you want to do intellectually. And I realized there were all these curiosities in the language that I thought, how can all these curiosities be in one language? Is there some sort of unifying principle? So I tried to come up with a unifying principle. The Western way of doing science is to try to come up with a theory of what you're seeing. And so when I wrote the paper and said that it was based on the immediacy of experience principle, which is that they prefer to talk about now and not about the future, not about the past. And I brought in all these other things and explained how that would explain why they don't have these things. It occurred to me that there would be a lot of reactions along the lines of, you forgot to argue for this, you would need to do experiments to show this. These are all the empirical bits that are missing from your paper. Curiously, I never got a single argument like that, not a single one that had to do with empirical weaknesses in the argument. People simply said, he's a racist, or he's a liar, or, oh, this is great. So the reactions tended to be more ad hominem than they were intellectual. And at first that really bothered me. I had always been well liked in linguistics, and I knew Chomsky well, and I was a full professor at the University of Manchester in England. I had been a full professor at the University of Pittsburgh. But now all of a sudden people are not talking about me as somebody who's climbed the ranks of academia and actually gotten to be fairly prominent. They're talking about me as a sort of illiterate missionary who's put together all of this silliness in one paper and not really answering my objections. So I was invited not long after the paper appeared to give a talk at MIT. And it was one of the best attended talks they've had. Like 150 people were there from Harvard and MIT Linguistics and Brain and Cognitive Sciences and the Harvard Psychology Department and these places. Mark Hauser was there, who was one of the authors of the famous paper with Chomsky arguing for recursion. So there were a lot of questions, and I realized I can answer all these questions. This is not really, nobody's asking questions that are that hard. If somebody says I'm a liar, well, that's like asking me if I've stopped beating my wife. There's no way to answer that question. So I did get a lot of researchers to start coming down and double checking, running experiments. They checked for color words, they checked for number words, they checked for kinship terms, all of these things. And study after study corroborated what I had to say. And then they did a big study of Pirahã text stories to look for recursion, and they found no evidence for that. And then Jeffrey Pullum, a linguist from the University of Edinburgh, when this all started, he was at the University of California at Santa Cruz. He started looking into this, and he's a mathematical linguist whose recursion is the kind of thing that he looks at. And he started finding evidence from other languages that Pirahã might not be unusual. Not only is it not bizarre, but there are other languages that lack it. And there's a brand new book out in honor of me, a Festschrift for Dan Everett, in which there are a couple of articles. One of them is Jeff Pullum's article on Dan Everett and Pirahã syntax, in which he makes the case that I'm almost certainly correct from everything he can put together. This won't end the controversy. Because there are many people who have a commitment, a career commitment to the idea that I can't be right. Because if I'm right, Chomsky's wrong. And if Chomsky's wrong, a lot of careers are based on him. And so when you tie your career to a single individual and their ideas, it would be like if relativity theory was somehow shown to be wrong, although one shouldn't really compare relativity theory with any linguistic theory. Linguistic theories are more philosophy than they are science, and linguists tend to get worked up and think they're doing science, but a lot of it is just philosophy. And I love philosophy. I do a lot of philosophy, but it doesn't mean that it's physics, and that it's got the same level of intensity or mathematical. You don't need a lot of math to be a linguist. It helps. It doesn't hurt, but you don't need math to go down to the Pirahã. I would say that there are people who really hate me still.
Were you surprised by the ferocity of the hate that you received? For example, Noam Chomsky called you a charlatan to a Brazilian newspaper. This academic, Andrew Nevins, implied you were a fraudster. You mentioned their kind of identity in some way, or maybe their careers are tied up in this. But what exactly is the harm to them if, it turns out it's not like Chomsky is going to lose his job, right?
It's not a matter of losing your job. It's a matter of losing your credibility for the particular theory you're working in. Because if the founder of the theory says that all language is built on the property of recursion, that's the basic underlying thing that makes language possible, and then you find out that it isn't, then there's a huge gap there, and other theories will come along and say, we didn't need this. And one of the things I'm doing in my work on Peirce is to show that Peircean theory can capture everything about language that Chomsky can without the difficulties and a lot more. So there are better theories, and some of them are 100 years before Chomsky. But linguists aren't aware of those, and many linguists got into linguistics because of Chomsky. And there's another thing about Chomsky, which is his political activism. For many, many people, it's his status as the Einstein of linguistics that makes his politics so believable. So if you start to say that he lacks credibility of any sort in his core area of expertise, there will be many people who are furious because he needs that credibility fully to be able to have the voice he has talking against U.S. foreign policy, for example. I don't reject everything Chomsky's ever done. I think it turns out that he's fundamentally wrong about the general approach that he took, but I think the same about string theory and physics, but it doesn't mean I don't like people who are wrong. I'm wrong about a lot of stuff. We're all wrong about more stuff than we're right about. So I don't fully understand the emotional vitriol, and then I had this reputation of being a publicity hound. Well, I didn't ask you to do a podcast about me, and I had the New York Times call me, and at the end of a long interview, they put me on the cover, a big picture of me on the cover of the New York Times, And the reporter said, "I've heard that you're a publicity hound." I said, "Look, did I call you and ask you to interview me?" I said, "Is that how the New York Times works? Somebody calls them up and says, interview me, so they get an interview?" I said, I really think that's a kind of naive question, frankly. You called me out of the blue. You wanted to do this story, so that's up to you to do.
In fact, the way it usually works is they hire some PR person who has a connection to the reporter, right?
Yeah, yeah. I never had a PR person. I never did any of that kind of stuff. I spend most of every day at my desk. When I'm not teaching, which is I teach in the fall, and then from December to September, I'm just writing, and I'm pretty much just writing even in the fall. I write every minute I can. So, I don't have time to be worried about that sort of thing. And I'm writing about Charles Sanders Peirce, who's probably the greatest intellect ever produced in the United States. I may be a little bit biased, but I think there's evidence to back that up. And, he did a lot of really interesting stuff, but he wasn't trying to get publicity, and publicity didn't matter to him one way or the other. And I think that's the case if you're really engrossed in what it is that you're doing. If other people find it interesting, that's up to them, that's fine, but you don't have time to go out and say, looky here what I did. It's irrelevant.
So the specific claim that was really controversial with people who subscribe to the Chomskyan worldview is that Pirahã doesn't have something called recursion. Why is this specific thing so important to your critics? It seems, I try to read up on universal grammar, and it's a bit confusing what exactly it is, right? Is it a specific theory? Is it a research program? Are there any claims that are being made? But somehow for these critics of yours, it seems to all hinge on whether or not recursion is like a universal feature of human language. So could you give more context about what the importance is?
So Chomsky says that that recursion, and this is the only reason anybody cares about it, it's because Chomsky said it. Nobody would have ever cared about it one way or the other. But Chomsky says recursion is all that there is to the narrow language faculty. That is, what is specific to human language is recursion. So his first reaction to me, the critic's first reaction, is that I'm wrong. The next reaction is I'm lying. And the final reaction is it's irrelevant. So I'll forget about the wrongness. I'm not wrong. So I'll assume that I'm not wrong. And I'm not lying, so I'll assume that I'm not lying. So what about the idea that it's irrelevant? Chomsky has said that if a language chooses not to use recursion, that doesn't mean he's wrong. It simply means they've chosen not to use it. And it's like somebody who chooses not to use both eyes by putting a patch over one. Yeah, that doesn't really make much sense because we can take the patch off and we can tell that the person has stereoscopic vision unless they've got some damage to their eye. But I asked Chomsky once, I said, okay, so you say Pirahã could get by, it doesn't use recursion, but it has it there. Well, what about if there were two languages that didn't use recursion? What about if there were 30 languages that didn't use recursion? What about if there were 6,000 languages that didn't use recursion? Your argument wouldn't change because there's no empirical claim. I said, what is the empirical claim? How could I possibly falsify the idea that recursion is the only part of the narrow language faculty? How could I show that to be wrong? His answer was, universal grammar is a field of study like biology. You can't show that biology is wrong. That's a category mistake. I said, well, what is it about your specific proposal in this new field you've created of universal grammar that could possibly be shown to be wrong? I said, I still don't see any empirical content. Either you're making the claim that all languages have it, and so Pirahã shows that they don't, or you're not making a claim. What is the claim? And there's been nobody's answered that. There is no claim there. It's confusing because they're confused about what they're trying to say. But in Peirce's view of universal grammar, what's important are the interpretations. It's not the form of the sentences. So if I say no shirt, no shoes, no service, that's three separate sentences. There's no recursion there. If you're not wearing shoes and if you're not wearing a shirt, then you get no service. So my interpretation is what's recursive, not the form of the grammar. And so when I tell people, look, if Chomsky said that interpretations require recursion, no problem. I don't have a problem with that. But Chomsky didn't say that. He said the grammar of sentences has to have recursion, and that's false. So it's interesting to me that many linguists themselves don't grasp this distinction. They believe that if the Pirahã can interpret sentences recursively, that they do have recursion in the grammar, but that's not the case. And Jeff Pullum, in his article in the new Festschrift book, which can be downloaded for free from Language Sciences Press, goes into this in great detail and shows that he really goes into these arguments. Then he gives data from other languages, and he goes into some of the attacks on me and how those attacks, he gives much more detail on the personal and professional attacks on me by Chomsky and by many others than can be found anywhere else.
I want to zoom out and just ask like a meta question. Like, how did it come to be that universal grammar, how did it come to have so much influence over all of linguistics academia, right? If it's ultimately, as you argue, is so misguided.
Well, like many, many good ideas, I tell people it's a good idea. It didn't work out. But it was a great idea. Chomsky studied logic. He studied computer science at the beginning of computer science. He had a reasonably good self-taught background in mathematics. He came up with some analyses. He wasn't talking about universal grammar, but he had some analyses of very difficult to analyze linguistic facts that people found elegant, convincing, and just brilliant. And they were. And the fact that they were brilliant doesn't mean they're impervious to error. I think they were all wrong. So he came out with these analyses that were brilliant, very convincing, got a lot of people to start following them. And then he started looking at language as a whole. And he said, Descartes said that there's a universal grammar. Descartes is the one who started seeing instincts and nativism. The biological basis for universal grammar is what Chomsky found in Descartes. So people found this really strikingly bold claim that behaviorism was wrong, and he was just so devastating with his critics and so convincing, and his politics at the same time. He was standing up against the Vietnam War at a time when it was dividing the country terribly. He was this hero for American activism and against American foreign policy at the same time that he was providing these incredibly innovative analyses and bold revival of Cartesian nativism. And so he became very popular. And then people thought, because of the teeny little bit of mathematics in it, computer science was just starting to come along, and they thought this could be the basis for machine translation and would have all kinds of computational applications. Psychologists were very interested because he said that the passive is derivationally more complex than the active sentence, and therefore it predicted that people would have a harder time processing passives than active sentences. There were a ton of predictions, and it drew a lot of attention. And then he predicted that because of universal grammar, children would go by leaps and bounds through their first language, but that after that, they would be struggling with language a little bit more. Adults have a harder time because our critical period has turned off. And for a long time, there were no answers to that. People just found it incredibly convincing. And there's still people who do find it convincing. I don't think there's any mystery to why Chomsky became so popular. I think the mystery is why he's still so popular, given all of the advances we've made in all of these sciences.
So ultimately, is your assessment that this whole universal grammar research program has been a dead end and it hasn't actually produced anything that's been empirically validated?
I wouldn't go that far. The British Academy had a special conference a few years ago on the 60th anniversary of the cognitive revolution, which supposedly by myth began with Chomsky. It didn't begin with Chomsky, and I don't think there ever was a revolution, but they were told that they had to have at least one dissenting voice. So they invited me to speak. And somebody said, so are you saying that nothing's ever been discovered of any value? And I said, no, I'm not saying that. Everybody in this room is really smart. You get a bunch of really smart people working for 50 years, they're going to find something out. It shouldn't be a shock that you've discovered some things about language. But you don't need universal grammar to explain any of it. If you're doing field research on a language in New Guinea and you find something out, it's not because of universal grammar. It's because you're a smart person who worked really hard to figure it out. And maybe you got some ideas from universal grammar, but universal grammar is not causally implicated in any of these analyses. There's nobody who says universal grammar predicts that they will have this, this, and this. Universal grammar just doesn't make those predictions, as Chomsky himself said. It's just a field of studies. We're smarter than other creatures, and so we have more symbols, and we're able to create symbols as we need them, and we're able to combine them. And these are features of general human intelligence and the logic of semiotics. You don't need a universal grammar to account for that stuff, at least not a biological universal grammar.
So then, zooming back into the specific controversy around your 2005 paper, Where did things ultimately settle in the end? What is the consensus of professional linguists nowadays on whether or not the claims in your paper are ultimately valid? And I guess like what do they teach their undergraduates about this paper now?
Well, there's no consensus, and it depends on what college you're in. So I regularly speak by Zoom to colleges who really like what I have to say and think that it illuminates a lot. And I never speak to the colleges who think otherwise. I find that curious. I would think that, there are colleges in the Boston area who are with linguistics departments that are very strongly Chomsky. And I would have thought they would have invited me to give a talk so that they could show to their students what an idiot I am. But they don't. They just avoid me. So there's no consensus. There are people who find my work fairly convincing. They don't find Chomsky's work convincing, and there are people who say I just couldn't be right. At this point, I just have to do the best that I can, and I'm not bothered by this stuff anymore. Nothing surprises me. I don't read the critical work against me anymore because a friend of mine will read it, and I said, is there any new argument in it? No. Okay, I'm not going to read it. I don't need to be told I'm a liar. I don't need to read that stuff.
Right. To your point about your critics not really engaging directly with you, I found it pretty striking that, for example, like the Nevins, Pozetsky, Rodriguez paper, they must have spent dozens of hours writing that paper, and they never actually reached out to you, right? A lot of that paper was just like exegesis of your original work for your master's degree, and yet, they could have saved themselves a lot of time by just talking to you, but instead we get this like back and forth, like 5-layer back and forth, and over the course of something like 5 years.
When I spoke at MIT, they were all there at the time. They were all in Cambridge, and I got there early in the morning. My host at MIT had let them know that I was in my office that he had provided for me, and I was happy to meet with anybody to discuss Pirahã or any of the controversy. And every one of the linguists refused. They didn't just not hear or not respond. They said, I don't want to meet with him. Okay, well, why wouldn't you want to meet with? Are you afraid that I'm going to beat you up? They said that it's because I'm so unethical they wouldn't be able to believe anything I said. But that's not really it, I mean, they had a whole conference about my work in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. And I found out about this conference, and I said, hey, I'll fly down at my own expense and talk and meet with anybody. And they said, oh, we don't want you here. And the whole conference is basically about me. This doesn't overwhelm me as a great example of open-minded science.
It doesn't sound like science at all, right?
No, it's like religion. It's like, why would you invite an atheist to an evangelical meeting? You don't want to hear that stuff. One of the things people have tried to do to discredit my science is they've tried to discredit my character by saying I've gone to the Pirahã without proper authorization, which is totally false. I was just recently talking to people in the Brazilian government in the Indian agency, and found that, there are a lot of new people there, and they're all fans of Don't Sleep, There Are Snakes. If they thought that I had been going there illegally, they wouldn't have greeted me with open arms there. It's not like I'm a criminal. I'm a permanent resident of Brazil. When I land in Brazil, I get in the line with Brazilians to go through immigration.
Yeah, so I recall in the documentary that was made about your work, there was this heartbreaking scene in which you fly all the way to Brazil, and you come like prepared, and you're about to fly out and reunite with the Pirahã. And at the very last minute, you're told that the Indian agency, FUNAI of Brazil, has denied you permission to go. Who was behind that, and how did you feel when it happened? And have you been able to see the Pirahã since?
I have not been able to see the Pirahã since, but I'm optimistic about seeing them this next year. The person behind that was a guy named Valmir, who worked for the FUNAI up in the region near the Pirahã. And when I went there, he let me in at first. And so I did go there. And in the film, they show me in the village. And that was with Valmir's permission. But when we were going back, he denied me permission, because what we didn't say in the film is between the first visit and the second, he asked me for a $75,000 pickup gift to him to authorize me to go. So I said, I don't have $75,000. And he said, then you can't go. And he called Brasilia, his boss, and said, this guy's trying to go in illegally. So he did his best to get me into a lot of trouble. And with the Brazilian linguistics community, many of them, certainly not all by any means, but many of them being Chomskyans and having to do with approving my research plan, I had both ends working against me for several years, but I am optimistic that that is coming to an end before I die, and I'm hoping that this year I'm going to be able to go back in. And so what we're hoping to do, is to do a book of photographs of the Pirahã with the person who took the New Yorker photographs. I don't know if you saw the New Yorker.
Yeah, the interpreter.
Yeah, Martin Scholler, he wants to come back with me. So if we get our authorization, we're going to go back in. Martin and I and two people from the Indian Agency will go with us, along with a Brazilian colleague. And if it all goes well, we'll have a beautiful book of photos with my anthropological essays, along with the photos, and maybe get some essays by the Indian Agency people and stuff about the Pirahã. And it could be a very nice documentary book that concludes my time with the Pirahã. Martin's photos are just peerless. They're brilliant photos. He has so many also of the Pirahã that have never been published. That some of them have been in the National Portrait Gallery in D.C. So I think that's going to be a really fun project. We just have to get the final authorizations.
That's really exciting. So the Pirahã, they've maintained their language and their culture through, hundreds of years of contact with the outside world. But in the documentary that was filmed in 2012, we see that the government recently introduced gas generators. There's a television in the village. They have lighting.
All gone.
All gone?
All gone. I knew that was going to be the case when they were filming it. They knew cameras were coming in, so the government, this particular corrupt guy that I already mentioned, put all this stuff out there so he would look good to his superiors. And in fact, there was no money to keep those things going. And so none of that stuff works anymore. It's all pretty much gone. And he's been moved elsewhere because he was charged with corruption. Big surprise. So the landscape has changed. There's a lot of time. It's been 15 years since I've been there. And in 15 years, there's a lot of personnel turnover. And I was just blown away by the fact that people within the government are reading Don't Sleep, There Are Snakes and really liking it.
How optimistic are you about the ability of the Pirahã culture to endure into the future, right? And what would it mean if we were to lose that culture, if they were to, if that language no longer existed on the earth?
If they're left alone, they will endure, but they're not left alone. There are more and more encroachments. So I believe that the Indian Agency will do everything it can to make sure they're left alone. There's some good people there. But I believe that there are presidential candidates that would want to get rid of that agency. And if they're elected to the presidency of Brazil, that could dramatically set back the case for the Pirahã, and my optimism would diminish. If we lose the Pirahã language, we lose an entire way of thinking about the world, an entire way of solving problems that are common to all of us. We lose tremendous amounts of knowledge of the jungle and about every species of flora and fauna in the jungle that nobody but the Pirahã have. There are animals around them. I have seen many animals that, according to my book, Mammals of the Neotropics, have been extinct for decades, and yet I've seen them alive running around the Pirahã village as little babies. And that's all codified in their language. So if you lose that language, you lose that. If the Pirahã become Brazilianized, you lose most of the cultural knowledge and the linguistic knowledge, and they go from this rich repository of huge amounts of knowledge that have been gathered over the centuries to just poor, uneducated Brazilians. They go from being materially self-sufficient to being impoverished. It would be a tragedy of the first order for them, and it would be a tragedy in many important ways for the rest of the world to lose all of that knowledge.
So one final question. Do you have any regrets?
They asked Richard Nixon this after Watergate when he was retired in San Clemente, and he said, "I don't have time for that crap." I don't sit around having regrets. The regrets that I have are I was rude to somebody once, and I wished I hadn't been. And these things have nothing to do with linguistics. I mean, the biggest regret I have in my life is when I was 18 years old, driving late at night in Los Angeles. I saw two men attacking a woman, and I stopped my car, and I got my lug wrench out of the back, and I started coming towards them, and they both went like they were going to pull something on me, and I chickened out and drove away. And that's probably the biggest regret of my life, right there. And it's certainly nothing to do with any paper I wrote or anything like that. These are I've never forgotten that since I was 18 and wished I would have been more aggressive.
Well, this has been a really, really engaging conversation. I've had a lot of fun. Thank you so much, Dan.
Yeah, thank you. I'm sorry I got here a little bit late.